Under the new government, the Committee of Public Safety, they accumulated all power to a central government authority, established a state-run atheist cult of reason, and launched the Reign of Terror, to put to the guillotine all who oppose them. This idea of brutal suppression in the name of the greater good, of eliminating tradition and belief, and of holding a single centralized power of government that could control the lives of each individual, would lead to the ideas of communism and its system of socialism that would eventually sweep the world. And through history leading up until today, these two competing ideas of freedom and socialism have been at the heart of arguments on the role of government and the place of citizens. This has led to many attacks on the American character and attempts to demonize not just our history, but even the founding principles of this country. Yet who are the groups leading this charge against America?
So you have a situation where this Constitution has protected Americans' rights for 200 years. Their right to free speech, to assembly, their right to keep and bear arms, their protection from seizure of their assets, unlawful searches, unreasonable searches. It's given the American people more freedom than anybody has enjoyed in world history, and consequently more prosperity than anybody has enjoyed in American history. But it has stopped tyrants gaining power. And so the Constitution is the enemy of all tyrants. So every tyrant in America right now, from the radical left to the globalists to big tech to the Communist Party of China, are all trying to destroy the US Constitution. Because if they can do that, they have complete power over every aspect of our lives. That's their dream, and that's our nightmare. The left has tried to demonize America. It's tried to propagandize against this country, to create racial division here, to use the fifth column, the communists within this country, to create as many problems as they can. So America has to be destroyed. It has to be destroyed morally. It has to be destroyed through propaganda and even physically, because America is the example of what people could be, of what freedom can look like, of the prosperity, the creativity that is unleashed when you have a free society. The American people, in my experience, are the most benevolent people, the kindest people, and the most tolerant people that exist on the planet. But they're also a little bit naive and a little bit complacent, and they think it's all going to go on forever, and they do not understand that every evil dictator on the planet is working overtime to bring this country to its knees.
The New York Times has a new project marking 400 years since the first African slaves were brought here to the U.S.
The 1619 Project, in an attempt to reframe America's history through the lens of slavery.
The New York Times Magazine is launching a series called the 1619 Project.
How is it that America is being attacked? Much of this narrative is coming from a rewriting and falsifying of American history. There's a push now to adopt the framework of the 1619 Project from the New York Times, which even its own fact-checker said contained false claims into American education. There are radicals pushing to tear down statues of America's history, ban books that present history they don't like, and physically attack anyone who espouses the ideas of freedom that they hope to destroy. Many of these people are animated, however, by a false understanding of American history. And one of the main authors who spread this falsified history was communist sympathizer Howard Zinn, author of the 1980 book, People's History of the United States.
Howard Zinn's interpretation goes back to 1913 to Charles Beard, whose theory has been debunked several times over. And Charles Beard had a materialist interpretation of the Constitution. He basically said that it was set up by men of privilege to preserve their material privilege. And Howard Zinn pretended to be uncovering this long-lost theory, and, as if it were brand new, and said, you think that the founders, set up this Constitution in order for the general welfare and the harmony of society and to keep law and order and to protect individual rights. Well, no, that's not really true. Here, let me tell you about this revolutionary theory by Charles Beard. And so Zinn basically reinvents that and says that they had set it up to preserve their own power, that it was very clever of them, they gave enough to the middle classes, the craftsmen, the mechanics, and so forth, in order to keep them satisfied.
Now, this is the way that they frame the American Constitution and the American system is that, they frame America as this system of slavery, of oppression, rather than the opposite interpretation, which used to be the take on it, that America was a symbol of freedom for the world.
Well, it was, a beacon. I mean, there were very few places where people had rights guaranteed to them, and where there weren't titles of royalty, where people were allowed to think of themselves as sort of elevating themselves by their own efforts.
Among the many tricks that Howard Zinn used was to take information out of context in order to falsify its meaning. This included, for example, taking the Journal of Christopher Columbus, beginning a quote from one page, and using an ellipsis to continue the quote several pages later, completely altering its meaning. And contrary to the narrative spread these days that America's founding fathers launched their revolution only to preserve their rights to hold slaves, in reality, they fought a near impossible battle against the most powerful empire in the world, with many losing their fortunes and even their lives in the process. Contrary to the falsified stories now being presented, the reason the founding fathers launched the revolution is clearly explained in their notes, and clearly laid out in the Declaration of Independence. It states, "The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having an indirect object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states." And it lays out 27 grievances committed against the colonial Americans. Among these were trial without jury, burning towns, abdicating the local government, taxing without consent, and transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, among others. But the question remains, if the founding fathers believed in freedom, then why did they have slavery?
The Declaration, as approved by the Continental Congress, has a list of charges against King George III. And following the rules of rhetoric, you start with the least and you end with the worst, right? But then you get to his final charge, and his final charge is this. He says, King George III has created cruel war against human nature itself, enslaving men, and Jefferson puts men, right? So any question here about were blacks included under all men are created equal? Yes. Abraham Lincoln thought that the bloodiness of the Civil War was spiritual payback for the sin of slavery. So yes, absolutely, we understand the contradiction, as Lincoln put it, between the theory of equality and the practice of slavery at the time. But here's the point. The founders were aware of that contradiction. And they all envisioned, especially at the time of the founding, slavery gradually withering away. Thomas Jefferson, after we declared revolution and each state wrote its own constitution, Thomas Jefferson, a slaveholder, proposed that Virginia outlaw slavery in its constitution. So this caricature that you have these evil, rich white men who designed a constitution to keep the poor down and to keep minorities down and to keep women down, it's so easy to see the falsehood of that if you just spend a little time reading what they actually said and were trying to do. Frederick Douglass, to Abraham Lincoln, to Martin Luther King Jr., who all said that your Declaration and Constitution are wonderful, noble principles, and now just live up to them better. They would replace that with the rejection of the Declaration of Independence, the rejection of equality of opportunity, and governments intervening in order to ensure equal outcomes, which means an end to individual liberty.
It's certainly true that in the 18th century, everyone was racist. We're talking something that's 225 years ago, and obviously if that existed today, we would condemn it. The point about the Constitution isn't that social reality of racism. It's, in fact, the reality that these founders, and not just the men who wrote it, but the families that raised them, their moms, their siblings, the unnamed people in history, ironically even some of their slaves or free people of color, were part of a society that did something very radical, first with the Declaration and then with the Constitution. And that was, say, two things. The first is that government's job is to defend our liberties. Its whole purpose, actually, is to make sure that we have our freedoms. And the second is that whatever government does comes from the consent of the governed. The Constitution was the vehicle by which we could enshrine the rights of those people who had been oppressed. So in fact, those people who believe that America is an imperfect society ought to first accept that the Constitution is the vehicle that allows us to address some of the significant social concerns they have. What the Constitution got perfect, I would say that very rarely as a historian, was putting two seemingly competing goods, two competing aims in balance. On the one hand, liberty, and on the other hand, order. And what I've told students over the years is we don't want unfettered liberty because it's chaotic. We also don't want just complete order because there's not a lot of freedom. What the Constitution did was put into constitutional governance the ability of our governed and the government to keep those things in balance.
Challenges to the new ideas of freedom came early on in the American system. Among the first was the Alien and Sedition Acts, signed into law by President John Adams in 1798. These made it illegal to make alleged false statements critical of the federal government, and while they lasted only 3 years until 1801, Thomas Jefferson's criticism of those acts helped him win presidential election in 1800. The acts were later denounced as being unconstitutional, and they drifted from the concepts of free speech established in the United States, which even included the freedom of seditious speech against the government. Among the most read documents at the time of the Founding Fathers was an essay by John Mill that explained a concept of the marketplace of ideas. This concept deeply informed the views on a need for freedom of speech, including speech that could be seen as dangerous even to state power.
One of the treatises that all of the founders were familiar with, because they were educated men, was John Milton's Areopagitica, which was an essay to the British government, to the British people, and to the world really, argument for free speech, and the internet of their day, which was the printing press. And the Crown in England decided that what they were going to do was license printers with an oath not to print anything that was critical of the Crown or the acts of government. And Milton's point was, don't shut down the printing press, don't gag order the printers, don't require a loyalty oath from printers, because that way you will not have the diversity of opinion that's necessary for the good ideas to rise. Don't have a closed marketplace of ideas, have an open one. All the founders understood that. As a matter of fact, it was noted by at least one legal scholar that that was an essential treatise that the founders had in mind when they put the free speech clause into the First Amendment. Not only that, but the freedom of the press, freedom of the printing press, and the freedom of editorial control of newspapers of their day to have a wide variety of opinions, including but not limited to criticism of the government. And of course, they had just come from a revolution where they fought against a monarchy. They didn't want a monarchy approach to complete control over the organs of information. They wanted that to be a diversity of opinion and freedom in the hands of individual citizens.
The American idea of freedom and the socialist model of the